Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and today we look at a renewed emphasis on people in the age of AI. Efficiency and productivity tools such as Gen AI get all the attention, but the fact is they don't work without human beings. So the question for organizations going forward is how to strike a balance that helps employees gain valuable AI skills while simultaneously giving the organization a competitive edge. Joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site to discuss is Dr. Ben Waber, visiting scientist at MIT and author of People Analytics, George LaRocque, founder of WorkTech, a global market analyst and advisory firm, and Cliff Jurkiewicz is back with us, vice president of global strategy at Phenom, a global AI company specializing in human resources. Gentlemen, it's great to have all of you with us on what is, clearly a hot topic for everyone on the enterprise level. And Dr. Waber, one study found that 93% of chief human resources officers say they use AI in their organizations, but more than 2/3 of employees say that they don't. So clearly there's a disconnect. It's undeniable, but it can be overcome if you start to think about the shifting the focus back to people. So your PhD work focused on computer science and organizational behavior. You can see where some of those parallels are. What do you think is the big problem when it comes to people and how they're talking about emerging AI tech?
Yeah, well, and I think the numbers that you cited, I mean, that sort of gets to some of the issue, right? Like, what do we even call AI at this point? I mean, at this point, it is sort of like all things to all people. Right. And so the idea that me using, traditional search engine, like there's of course a lot of, sort of statistical methods behind that to return results. That's different than when we're talking about things like ChatGPT that are, again, also these very large statistical models, but I think, that is certainly take up a lot of the oxygen recently. And I think that we just need to be a lot more specific when we talk about, like, if you're using AI, that again, it means so many things. So let's be specific about what are we using it for, what class of technology, and then what are we trying to achieve with it?
Yeah, and Cliff, you and I have spoken about this before, and it's a great point that Ben brings up. There's a big misconception around Gen AI and the potential to change the world, because in fact, many industries have been leveraging some sort of AI, not just Gen AI.
Sure, I mean, my take on probably the biggest misconception from my standpoint is that you have time. And I think to Ben's point, understanding and analyzing the use cases within the organization, I think that's why there's a disconnect between what the C-suite might be saying and what employees are feeling in the workplace, is that it hasn't trickled down, because I think they're not going about this the right way in terms of looking and analyzing the use cases within the organization, find out where these technologies can be immediately applied, be able to on some level experiment, on some level operationalize them fairly quickly, and sort of get their employee base up to speed in using these tools. And I think the misconception is the lack of interest in getting these tools in place, but also looking back at sort of the legacy way of doing things. And that's probably the biggest challenge. This becomes a cultural problem, right, as much as it is a technological problem.
Yeah, and Ben, we're going to get back to that in a moment, but yeah. Cliff, from your perspective, George, from your perspective, how has this wave of AI impacted VC and private equity activity as it relates to the human resources workspace?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting, because I think, analogous with that other stat, every startup, every vendor has to have an AI story right now. If you're not coming to market with an AI-driven roadmap, you're probably not getting that A, B, C round, and private equity is looking at their portfolio and looking for that same story. And what we find with our user research is that while the CHRO writes the check, I don't think the users realize that when they type in their search string or click on their workflow, that what's happening is an algorithm is bringing back the results or pushing the process forward. But that's been in our work tech industry for a long time. So I think it's an interesting inflection point right now as this is coming.
It really is, and one of the key themes, we just came back from CES in Vegas, and one of the key themes was, what's the ROI and where we're investing? Because you're going to have to start to show that somewhere on the balance sheet or somewhere within the organization.
Right, and that's driving so much of the all of the projects that I'm aware of, right, whether it's in the Fortune 100 or in the middle market. It's profitability, productivity, efficiency, results, it's business outcomes. And that, coming from some of the really cool but really gimmicky sort of, help me write this email, very effective type features to how do I demonstrate an ROI on that. That's where I think a lot of the tech players in the WorkTech space.
I mean, generating a pink elephant, playing soccer. There's ROI in that already, right?
But this is the challenge with time, right? Like if your excuse for not fully engaging with these technologies right now is, I'm going to wait for the ROI to reveal itself, it's going to pass you by very, very quickly.
Of course.
So the challenge is, how do you start to implement these tools and provide some level of use case analysis and start to build your own ROI? Because if you're waiting for the market to tell you the ROI is there, somebody else has already revealed it in their organization, they've operationalized it. And I think a really good example of this, over the last 5 years, the Mag 7 has grown at almost 50%. Last year it was 75%. The rest of the S&P 500, the other 493 companies, are growing, at a fraction of that. What's the difference? It's operationalizing AI in their organization. They're not waiting, they're creating their own ROI.
Right, and not to get off topic here, but when you think about, what's the next investment in, quantum computing, perhaps that's 3, 5, 8 years out. If you are not investing in that now, never mind agentic AI or the newer AI applications, but I want to get back to the human part of the equation for a moment and how that's being removed. And we saw this in 2018 with the rush to blockchain, right? You're trying to integrate these stories into your internal and external offerings, and of course it's a very competitive environment because the technology evolves so quick. Is it realistic when you think about how the C-suite and senior management is thinking about having more productive employees? Are they going about it the right way?
I mean, I think, and it even gets back to the previous part of the discussion where we're talking about, what is the ROI, or what do we care about? And I think the idea of deploying these systems effectively means being very explicit about what are we trying to accomplish by introducing this technology, right? And so if we say productivity, just being very explicit about, okay, is that task completion time, which actually I would argue is a very bad metric to look at. Is it, do I want to look at the growth of the company from a couple of different financial metrics, but it may be over a 1 year or 2 year period? Well, then just be explicit about that, right? And again, to Cliff, to your point, that doesn't mean necessarily not rolling things out, but it does mean have certain metrics in mind that you want to see move over that period, and be very thoughtful about how systemically you're incorporating that technology into your business, and then just checking. Again, if in a year it doesn't move that metric, try something else. But I think too many companies today are saying, we're going to do this because everyone's doing it, which is a terrible reason to do anything, frankly, right? And just be very focused on what you want to do.
Well, if I could jump across the table and high-five you on that
there
point.
There we go, okay. I'm pretty short, so I won't make it. Yeah,
but let's talk about this hype cycle for a minute, Cliff. When you're looking internally, externally to deploy these types of technologies, are we thinking about risk management? Are we thinking about cyber? Are we thinking about the vulnerabilities? Especially when when you think about generative AI, perhaps you don't intentionally mean to put sensitive data in there, and it inadvertently happens. Are the industries thinking about that kind of risk?
Yeah, I think they certainly are, but I think it's also a barrier to the conversation. We have what's happening in some of the marketplaces. Our legal and compliance are coming in and putting a stop to all of this and saying, we're not touching any of this until these use cases play themselves out on somebody else's turf. You're going to miss a huge opportunity. I mean, there's a way to do this and a way to engage with these technologies that is safe for the company. And it starts with knowledge and education. You have to educate right away. And we talked about this last time I was on the show, last year. We talked about building governance around this and inviting not only your internal stakeholders, but the vendors and partners that you're working with that are building and deploying these technologies in your operation, saying, let's come together and figure out a better path to governance and education. Once you do that, once you understand how these tools are used, the data they use, the data that they collect, it becomes a lot there's a lot less fear. You bring the fear down in the room, and you create an opportunity for someone to say, okay, can we do X with that?
Right, well, and that's also, in another part of the conversation is policy framework around that, and understanding how to operate in a regulatory environment. So, George, with this emerging of AI on the HR tech stack and what that means for human resources specifically, there's a couple things that factor into that. Of course, you have data privacy, you have EEOC, right? There's a lot that goes into it in addition to the tech stack that you can't get around.
Right, right. And I think Cliff is 100% on track. I think this technology represents an opportunity for HR leaders, for organizations to leverage this tech to become more compliant, to help reduce bias. The humans running the process for decades, centuries, have sometimes been out of compliance, and many times we all have bias. We bring that to the table. We can leverage these tools to help with that. We are seeing great ROI, great productivity gains, and great success in things like hiring internally and externally, where these have been applied thoughtfully.
Yeah, and Ben, let's go back to, you had mentioned before analyzing what's a low value task and what is more meaningful for the company. Can you give us some examples? Because in my mind, the efficiency of what I do day to day has certainly improved. So for me, that metric feels like it's a good thing.
Yeah.
How should enterprises be looking at it?
I think that the question again is like for some of these low value tasks that maybe in a vacuum look like if I could just automate that away, that will make people more productive. It could, and it 100% could. But again, I think the question is, what do you as an organization care about? And there's a lot of good research, for example, on that some tasks that are somewhat boring and rote, that some percentage of the day, if you're able to devote it to that actually people like that. It actually keeps them engaged at work. Now, again, if that's 100%, for a lot of people that won't be engaging. Again, it depends on your workforce, though. It could be for some of your, for your workforce. But if you remove that because you're like, oh, that's rote, and again, it's easy to do, the types of tasks you want to do that for when you have lots of data, there's quantitative outcomes, there's lots of good research on what you should do there. But again, I think that if you end up automating those things, and yeah, in a nutshell, in a vacuum, it increases performance, let's say 10%, but maybe it makes 50% of the workforce more likely to leave in the next year, I'm not going to do it, right? And so I think you need to look at those more macro outcomes as well and saying, not just what is technically feasible, like that's fine. The first question is, what do you care about as a business? And then, is there technology we can apply to those things we care about? And if yes, great. And if not, don't just try to jam it in because the technology theoretically exists.
Right, and the challenge is the technology is evolving so quick.
Yes.
Faster than regulators can put some framework around it, faster than companies can adapt and even budget for it, right? I mean, our conversation could look very different a year from now. What happens when you think about redundancy? We were talking about this off camera. We used to go to the library, do research, and have microfiche and the card catalog and the Dewey Decimal System and all that. If the internet stopped tomorrow, I would know how to find books in the library. So are redundancies in place?
So I think one of the issues I've got with the current way that a lot of these technologies are designed is they create the case for plausible automation, right? In that I can now have, like, let's say instead of having an assistant, you have, ChatGPT answer your emails, right? Now, that doesn't mean that tomorrow you're going to lose $1 billion, right? Like, it doesn't, right? But let's use a different example. Let's say I have a large language model write the employee handbook for my company, right? And it's 50 pages. Now, should I go through that and check that it's correct? Like, yeah, but I'm going to read the first page and be like, okay, it's probably fine. Now, let's say, for a variety of reasons, it's probably likely that it won't have a section in there about sexual harassment, right? So again, it doesn't mean that tomorrow the company loses $1 billion, but maybe in a couple of years something horrible happens, right? And then the company's open to all sorts of liability and all these other things. Now again, are you going to be able to backtrack that because you use a large language model? That's what happened? Like, no, right? So again, could I say I get rid of all my HR people and then do that? You could, but I think that you should only do that if you're not thinking about things systemically, right? And I think that companies that don't think about things systemically will probably not hire or fire a lot of people. And if I had to bet, I'm going to say that in a couple of years, they're going to have a lot of productivity problems that they'll probably pass off, pretend it's something else, but it's probably going to be due to this.
Which is interesting, George. We had an EEOC commissioner on the show last April, and my question to him was, if we don't have AI frameworks in place, what if an AI application made an error that a human would catch? And he said to me, he's like, Jill, regardless of what policies are out there is framework that exists right now. And if you violate the standards that we have set forth for equal employment opportunity, you're still liable for it, right?
Right.
And that's, to Ben's point, you can't backtrack.
Right. You've got to have humans in the loop someplace. And where I've seen, to your example of the handbook and the risk there, I've seen great examples where the large language model and the generative AI is used for the conversation, and there are rails around the policies, the documents, the handbooks, and what that AI is drawing its answer from, if you will. So I think that that allows the company to have the experts create the policy, create what is going out to the workforce and how they're interacting, while the large language model is making it a good experience to ask the question and get your answer quickly.
Right. So Cliff, it's 2025, and we just said before, it could be a different conversation a year from now. So how do you wrap your head around this hype cycle and momentum and figure out what the next big iteration is, and how do you effectively plan for it?
Yeah, well, I would say, I will use an analogy. Like, think of this as your favorite television series. And we are starting in 23, as the first season, and this is the second season or third, this is the third season. This isn't going to be a big reveal in 2025. This isn't going to be the end episode where all the secrets are revealed, into some shocking relevancy. This is the setup episode for the future. It's all the little things in the background that are happening, the nuanced things, the understanding the process and analyzing your organization. How do you implement this? I think the big reveal is going to be over the next 2 years, 26 and 27. I think you're going to see it, but you have to be engaging in this now, right? This is the year. It's sort of that setup. Understanding your organization, how to apply it. And I think this is probably the biggest opportunity for HR. I think HR and people organizations really missed a huge opportunity post-COVID to expand their relevancy and their leadership. Yeah. You rarely get a second swing. They're getting a second swing pretty quickly. When Jensen Huang gets up on the keynote in CES and says, essentially, IT is going to become HR because they're the ones buying the agentic technologies and implementing them, I would say that's the perfect opportunity for HR to come and say, no, this is a cultural and a value proposition, and we need to be a part of the conversation and lead that. So this is the second swing of the bat for HR, and they can't miss it this time.
See, and that's another high five moment, Ben, because you could think of it in the same perspective as your information and security teams as well, right? Everyone is taking on some sort of risk, and almost all the way up through the CFO function for that reason. So how do you, compete for all of these resources and make sure that you're allowing the companies to operate in a compliant way?
Well, this is sort of what I worry about, though, is that similar to those other areas you mentioned, right? Like in cybersecurity, suddenly this gets elevated to a board discussion when you have like the whole SolarWinds case, and then DOJ actually brings charges against people, right? I worry that for the people side, it's going to be a similar thing where you're going to have some organizations roll this stuff out in a very unthinking way, and then horrible things happen, and then it gets elevated, right? And I think that my preferred track would be sort of, Cliff, what you mentioned is saying, all right, like ultimately, people are what makes the organization what it is, right? And that improving the way the organization functions, requires you to use technology in a way that accentuates the way people collaborate, the way they function. If we think about the history of technology, right, we think about the existence of chat, email, the internet. Those are things that have changed the way that people work and collaborate, right? But that if you roll those out in terrible ways, a lot of companies don't exist that did that. And I think you will see a similar thing happen today, but like everyone's saying, that'll happen more quickly than it would have in the past.
All right, and I want to get your perspective on it as well, George. I mean, from the investment perspective, how are you thinking about what's next? Where are you deploying capital when about a year out, let's call it that?
Well, all the investors that I'm working with right now, last year was a really interesting year, right? They sort of took a step back and they've been watching this evolve. And I think you're going to see the lens shifting to agents, the lens shifting, generative is in the market, and we're looking at, to your point, what's next? How are we going to leverage these agents in the enterprise? And I think on the buyer side, it's about doing it thoughtfully.
Yeah, and Ben, it was interesting again at CES when you're starting to see all these themes emerge as it relates to user experience. Yeah. With agentic AI, apps might not even be. I mean, was it the tagline? There's an app for that?
We'll see. I mean, okay, prediction is hard, especially about the future, right? I mean, I sort of don't like the term agents because it sort of feels like, we call an Excel macro an agent, like at this point.
Right.
Like it says, okay, I get 10 emails and do so. Again, I'm not saying it's not useful, it's fine, right? But I think that, I do think that maybe to your point, there's been so little innovation on the interface side to a lot of these technologies, which has been really frustrating. Like, again, we were talking about it a little bit, earlier, but, I thought we banished command lines 30 years ago because they were terrible, user experience. And now what we've done is bring them back, but also make them stochastic, make them random. Like, that's a terrible idea. And so we can do way better, right? And I think that a lot of the things that you're talking about, this idea of using these technologies in other, experiences, other interfaces, right? Is it getting rid of an app? It totally could be, but I think that's much more interesting than saying, I'm going to make this stochastic command line interface a little bit better. Like I don't think that's the way to go.
So Cliff, in the last 30 seconds here, is this skill set available to keep up with all these strategic implementations that companies are thinking about?
Yeah, so during and post-pandemic, we called it, we had a lot of different terms for the movement of employees around, and the Great Resignation was the big one, right? I'm calling this the Great Recalibration. And I think that's really the best way to describe what's going to happen, which is a recalibration of skills and work within organizations to understand how to align these technologies in ways that are going to bring value to the individual and to the organization. Organizations that are doing that right now, that are engaged with this right now, are going to be far better off in the next 2 to 3 years than those that don't. And this is what we started this conversation with. The biggest misconception is you have time to make these decisions. You don't. And those that are doing it now are going to be better off. But this recalibration that has to happen really is about bringing new skills to your employees so that they can leverage these tools in really meaningful ways. That's where HR has value.
All right, and we'll leave it at that. Thank you for everyone's insight, and thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.